It was the summer of 2002, a season when everything was supposed to feel open-ended and limitless. Three friends, bonded through years of late nights in dorm rooms, shared classes, and the fragile confidence of being 21, made a plan that felt simple and harmless. They wanted one last trip together before graduation forced them into jobs, careers, and lives that might never cross paths again. The idea was as old as college itself: pile into a car, map out a loose plan, and drive. Their families thought nothing of it. A road trip across the desert highways of Arizona and California sounded like the kind of adventure every young person deserved. The car they took was nothing glamorous. A faded blue sedan one of them had borrowed from an older brother. It rattled on the highway, but it ran. The three of them packed the trunk with duffel bags, bottled water, disposable cameras, and a few changes of clothes. According to friends who spoke with them in the days before they left, they had no fixed route in mind. They talked about seeing the Grand Canyon, maybe heading west to Los Angeles, or simply following back roads until they got tired and turned toward home. What mattered was not the destination, but the ritual of going. On the morning of June 14th, they set out. Witnesses remembered seeing them laughing as they pulled away from campus, music blasting through the open windows. For the first 2 days, there was nothing unusual. They called their parents to check in, stopped at diners along the interstate, and took snapshots of wide desert skies. A gas station attendant in a small town near the edge of the Mojave Desert would later recall that the three of them pulled in just before sunset, filling the tank, grabbing sodas, and joking loudly as if the night was theirs. It was the last confirmed sighting of them alive. When they failed to return by the end of the week, concern turned quickly to alarm. Families who had expected tired but happy students to walk through their doors instead found silence. Calls to their cell phones went unanswered, though in 2002, coverage across long stretches of the desert was notoriously unreliable. Parents began phoning each other, trying to piece together the last conversations they'd had. One mother remembered her daughter saying they were heading toward California, but no one knew what road they had taken. A father swore he heard traffic noise in the background of his son's last call, which meant nothing and everything at once. Within 48 hours, police were notified. At first, local authorities hesitated, assuming three young adults might have chosen to extend their trip without telling anyone. But the tone of the families convinced them otherwise. These were not children prone to disappearing acts. They were responsible, grounded, preparing for their final semester before entering the workforce. And none of them had the kind of money or resources to simply vanish for long. Something felt wrong. The search began small, with patrol cars checking rest stops and state troopers alerted along nearby highways. When nothing turned up, helicopters were brought in to sweep over miles of desert terrain. Search and rescue teams walked dry washes and canyons, scanning for tire tracks or the glint of metal. Canine units were dispatched to trailheads. Flyers with their photos were distributed to truck stops, diners, and motels across 3 states. Yet there was no sign of them, no abandoned car, no discarded belongings, not even a set of footprints in the sand. The desert, it seemed, had swallowed them whole. For the families, each passing day turned into a waking nightmare. Fathers retraced possible routes with road maps spread across their kitchen tables, drawing lines with shaking hands. Mothers called hospitals from Nevada to California, hoping their children might have been admitted under Jane or John Doe. Friends organized vigils on campus, holding candles in the summer heat and praying for a breakthrough. Detectives cycled through theories: a breakdown followed by dehydration, a wrong turn that led them into remote country, or something darker involving strangers on the highway. Every possibility was terrifying, yet none came with evidence. The gas station sighting became the anchor point of the investigation. Employees confirmed the students had fueled up there, but the security camera that might have shown what direction they drove next was out of service. Investigators asked drivers passing through if they remembered seeing the sedan. A few claimed they had, but their stories contradicted one another. Some placing the car on Route 66, others insisting they saw it heading south. With no digital trail, no cell data, and no witnesses who could agree, the case slipped into uncertainty almost immediately. By the end of the first month, the official search scaled back. Authorities admitted they had no leads. The desert was too vast, the roads too many, the chances of finding 3 missing people too slim without some clue to guide them. Families, however, refused to let go. They drove stretches of highway themselves, scanning the landscape from behind the wheel, imagining every dirt track might be the one their children had taken. Some even hired private pilots to circle the desert, hoping to spot the flash of metal or the shape of a vehicle hidden under sand. The sky yielded nothing. The silence left behind was suffocating. In a world before constant GPS tracking and real-time updates, the possibilities stretched endlessly. They could have broken down and fallen victim to the desert's heat. They could have been picked up by someone offering help who turned into a threat. Or, in the darkest whispers, they could have staged their disappearance altogether. But deep down, the families knew the truth lay somewhere out there, buried in the miles of empty land that stretched between the last gas station and whatever came next. And as the weeks turned to months, one haunting fact became clear. Whatever happened on that road trip had left no trace. The desert, silent and vast, was holding on to its secret. When the first reports of the missing college students reached county authorities, the urgency of the desert was not lost on them. In midsummer, the Mojave can turn lethal in hours. A car breaking down without water or shade could spell disaster almost immediately. Within days, search and rescue teams mobilized. Helicopters lifted off at dawn, sweeping across the endless ridges and washes, their spotlights cutting over valleys that looked identical from the sky. On the ground, deputies drove mile after mile of cracked highway, pulling over at rest areas, walking abandoned dirt tracks, calling the names of 3 people they had never met. The desert gave nothing back. Tracks that might have once belonged to their car were erased by shifting winds and drifting sand. Tire impressions melted into the ground within hours. Even trained canine units struggled, noses overwhelmed by heat and dust, their handlers frustrated by how quickly a lead turned cold. The heat itself became an adversary. Searchers reported dizzy spells and nausea after only minutes in the open. Water trucks had to be stationed at intervals just to keep teams functioning. For investigators, the absence of modern data was almost as crippling as the landscape. In 2002, cell coverage across remote desert highways was patchy at best. None of the 3 had GPS-enabled phones, and there were no pings to track. Credit card records showed no purchases beyond that last stop at the small-town gas station. No motel receipts, no restaurant tabs, no ATM withdrawals. It was as if the friends had simply ceased to exist the moment they left the pumps. As days turned into weeks, rumors began to spread, growing louder with each failed search effort. Some speculated the car had broken down and the trio wandered too far to be found. Others believed foul play was involved, that they might have picked up a hitchhiker or encountered someone along a desolate road who meant them harm. The most controversial theory was that they had chosen to vanish. Investigators heard whispers of debts, of strained friendships, even of staged disappearances. But none of those theories held up under scrutiny. Families insisted their children were responsible, deeply connected to their communities, and had no reason to run. Despite the lack of evidence, law enforcement poured resources into the case. Volunteers arrived from neighboring towns, scouring the desert floor with binoculars, carrying ropes and shovels, sometimes driving too far and needing rescue themselves. Airplanes equipped with infrared cameras were flown at night, hoping to catch some trace of heat or metal hidden under the sand. Nothing appeared. Not a scrap of clothing, not a tossed water bottle, not the faintest reflection of glass from a car window. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed everything. In press conferences, sheriffs stood under the glare of cameras, faces strained. They admitted to the media that the desert was too vast, that without a clear direction of travel, the search radius was impossible to contain. Maps were tacked up on briefing room walls, red circles expanding wider each day until they covered hundreds of miles. The more the map filled with ink, the clearer it became. They were looking for ghosts in a place that erased evidence faster than humans could track it. For the families, those weeks became a blur of waiting and pleading. They stood at the command posts handing out photographs, answering questions from reporters, and watching each helicopter return empty. Parents prayed their children had found shade, prayed someone had picked them up and taken them somewhere safe. Each time the radio buzzed with word of a discovery, hearts raced, only to collapse again when the news turned out to be false. Abandoned cars did surface during the search, but none belonged to the students. Each false alarm chipped away at hope. As the search dragged on, tension between families and investigators deepened. Some accused the police of giving up too quickly, of assuming the young adults had simply chosen to disappear. Authorities defended their efforts, pointing to the sheer scale of the land and the punishing conditions that made long-term searching impossible. By the end of the first month, official resources were quietly scaled back. Helicopters returned to their hangars, volunteers went home, and the search posts were dismantled. The desert search that began with urgency ended in silence. All that remained were a few weathered flyers posted to gas station doors, photographs curling under the heat, faces fading in the sun. The case, still unsolved, began to slide into the cold file cabinets of unsolved disappearances. For those left behind, the emptiness of the desert became a metaphor for their grief, wide, merciless, and without an end in sight. And with no new discoveries, only questions remained. What had happened after the gas station? Where had they gone? And how could 3 young people and an entire car simply vanish without leaving a single trace behind? With the desert search turning up nothing, investigators shifted their focus to leads that came in from across the region. Every phone call, every letter, every whispered rumor was logged and pursued. At first, there was optimism. Missing persons cases sometimes hinged on a single overlooked witness, a detail that seemed small at the time but unraveled everything later. Detectives hoped one of these tips would finally break the silence. The first wave of reports involved hitchhiker sightings. Several truck drivers swore they had seen 3 young people walking along remote highways, backpacks slung over their shoulders, matching the description of the missing friends. Patrol cars raced out to those stretches, sometimes hours later, only to find empty asphalt. Other callers claimed they had given rides to students who resembled them, but when questioned further, their stories fell apart. Confused timelines, inaccurate details, or descriptions that didn't match. Some were genuine mistakes. Others seemed like people craving attention in a case that had captured headlines. Then came the darker theories. A few tips suggested the students had been abducted, taken off the road by strangers who preyed on travelers. Residents near isolated towns spoke about suspicious vehicles following cars at night, headlights that trailed and then vanished. Some speculated that the trio had encountered violence after a breakdown, meeting the wrong person at the wrong time. Detectives explored known offenders in the area, cross-checking parolees and fugitives, but no links emerged. The case remained frustratingly clean. No crime scene, no evidence, no suspects. One of the more persistent threads involved the shadow of cartel activity. In the early 2000s, desert corridors near the southern border were often used for smuggling. Rumors spread that the students may have stumbled onto something they were never supposed to see, a transport route, a hidden stash, or armed couriers crossing the desert. The theory gained traction briefly after a rancher reported hearing gunfire in the distance around the time the students vanished. But again, no bodies, no burned-out car, no evidence tied the friends to cartel violence. The story dissolved back into speculation. For detectives, each false lead meant hours of paperwork and mounting frustration. Case files grew thick with notes, maps, and highlighted statements that ultimately led nowhere. Walls in the investigation room became cluttered with photographs connected by string, pointing to highways, truck stops, and desert towns scattered hundreds of miles apart. Each pin represented someone's version of the truth, and yet none could be verified. The more the case expanded, the less focused it became. Families clung to the idea that the lack of evidence meant survival. Parents told themselves their children were alive somewhere, maybe forced into silence, maybe living under new identities. Every time a tip suggested the possibility of survival, hope surged again. In interviews, one mother described keeping her daughter's bedroom exactly as it had been, convinced she would walk back in one day. A father admitted to scanning faces in crowded airports, believing he might spot his son boarding a flight under another name. Hope was painful, but giving it up felt worse. As the years passed, hope began to erode under the weight of time. Friends graduated, married, started families. The missing remained frozen in their early 20s, faces on aging flyers, while life moved forward without them. Vigils grew smaller, news crews stopped showing up, and anniversaries became private affairs held at graves without bodies. Families spoke less to reporters, weary of repeating the same words with no answers in return. The case itself was never officially closed. Detectives rotated in and out over the years, each bringing fresh energy, each hitting the same dead walls. They revisited old leads, retested bones from unrelated discoveries, reopened interviews with truckers and gas station clerks, but nothing connected. The files grew heavier, expanding into boxes stored in evidence rooms, marked with a case number that by then had become infamous locally. By the 20th year, the mystery carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer about frantic searching or breaking news headlines. It was about families left with scars, detectives haunted by the unsolved, and a community that had learned to live with unanswered questions. Theories still floated: abduction, accident, foul play, even voluntary disappearance. But none had ever been proven. The truth was somewhere out there, just beyond reach, buried in miles of sand and silence. And yet, with every rumor exhausted and every lead gone cold, the case file sat waiting. Notes, maps, and unanswered questions filled its pages. But the one thing missing was the only thing that mattered: the car itself. In the years that followed, the disappearance of the three friends refused to fade completely, not because of new evidence, but because their families refused to let the memory go silent. Every anniversary, even when the media lost interest, someone lit candles at the campus chapel where they had last been together. Flyers were reprinted and pinned to bulletin boards in towns that barely remembered the case. Parents spent their savings on private investigators who promised fresh eyes, only to return with nothing but bills. Still, the families pressed on, because to stop searching felt like betraying their children. The toll of waiting grew heavier with each passing year. Marriages fractured under the weight of grief. One father admitted he could not walk past his son's untouched bedroom without feeling anger, not just at fate, but at the endless uncertainty. Some mothers became reclusive, their lives shrinking to the ritual of answering phone calls, just in case someone finally had news. Others channeled their energy into advocacy, speaking at events for missing persons, holding up faded photographs as warnings of how easily lives could vanish into silence. Children who had once been too young to understand grew up in the shadow of the mystery. Siblings described living with a presence that was more like a ghost than a memory. They inherited the search from their parents, combing through newspaper archives and internet forums, following every rumor of skeletal remains discovered in the desert, only to feel the same crushing disappointment when DNA tests ruled them out. For them, the missing friends were never just a story. They were an unfinished sentence that dictated the rhythm of their lives. The passage of time brought funerals, but not the right kind. Parents passed away never knowing what became of their sons or daughters. Graves were dug for spouses, for grandparents, for neighbors, while the three who had vanished remained unburied, their absence marked only by memorial plaques at vigils. Survivors described a kind of double grief, mourning both the people they had lost to death and the ones they could never properly say goodbye to. Every false lead left its scar. There were moments when the phone rang and a sheriff's deputy said skeletal remains had been found along a hiking trail or near a dry riverbed. For hours, sometimes days, families lived in suspended fear, bracing for confirmation. When the calls came back negative, the relief was hollow. Nothing had been solved. Their children were still out there somewhere, gone, but not declared gone. Despite the pain, families kept their children's names alive in the only ways they could. Local newspapers occasionally ran anniversary pieces, reminding readers of the vanished students from 2002. A few television shows featured the case in segments about mysterious disappearances, offering reenactments and speculation. For a brief moment, attention would flare, only to burn out again when no new evidence surfaced. The cycle repeated itself so many times that it became predictable. One sister described it as being thrown a rope that always turns to smoke in your hands. As the years stretched past a decade, the story became part of local legend. Residents of the desert towns near where the students were last seen spoke of them the way others spoke of ghost stories. Their faces became familiar, not just because of who they were, but because of what they represented: youth cut short, families broken, a mystery that resisted answers. Some treated the story with reverence, others with cynicism, whispering rumors about drug deals, secret relationships, or runaways. But for the families, the truth remained unchanged. They were three kids who left for a road trip and never came home. By the 20th anniversary, the weight of absence was almost unbearable. Survivors gathered once again at the campus chapel, holding photographs that had grown brittle at the edges. The crowd was smaller now, mostly siblings and a handful of loyal friends. But the grief had not dulled. A candlelight vigil was held as it had been every year, the glow flickering against faces that had aged 20 years since the last goodbye. Hope still lived in those candles, but it was a quieter hope now, tempered by decades of disappointment. And yet, no matter how much time passed, there was always the same lingering question. Somewhere in the vast expanse of desert, was there something they had missed? Some hidden evidence lying just out of reach? The families couldn't know it then, but the desert had been keeping a secret, one that would not be revealed until nature itself decided to move the sand and let it out. The Mojave has always been a place where secrets stay buried, but in the summer of 2025, nature itself decided to loosen its grip. For days, meteorologists tracked a storm system building over the desert, warning of winds strong enough to strip paint from buildings and reduce visibility to nothing. When it arrived, the sandstorm tore across the barren highway corridors with a violence that felt biblical. Miles of asphalt disappeared under shifting dunes, power lines were bent, and windows in nearby towns rattled under the force. Locals who had lived their whole lives in the desert said they had never seen anything like it. When the storm finally passed, silence settled again over the Mojave. The sand no longer moved, but what it left behind was not the same desert that had been there before. Drifts had shifted by dozens of feet, exposing parts of the land that had not been seen in decades. In one particularly remote stretch of highway, where traffic was so rare that days could pass without a single vehicle, a rancher driving home noticed something that didn't belong. At first glance, it looked like scrap metal, just the edge of something jagged sticking out from a sandbank. But as he slowed his truck, the shape came into focus, the corner of a car roof, sun-bleached and rusted, poking out from under the earth. The rancher knew the stories. In towns bordering the desert, the tale of the three college students who vanished in 2002 was as well known as the shifting dunes themselves. He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture, and drove straight to the sheriff's office. Within hours, deputies were on the scene, their boots sinking into sand still loose from the storm. They marked off the area, calling for recovery crews and forensic teams. What they were looking at could have been an abandoned wreck, another casualty of desert roads. But deep down, everyone knew it could be more. By the time recovery units arrived, the discovery had spread quickly. Officers unspooled crime scene tape across a stretch of silent highway, blocking off the area from curious onlookers. The sight of a vehicle emerging from the sand after 2 decades drew both fascination and dread. Crews began shoveling carefully, working in shifts to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. With each layer removed, more of the car's shape emerged, a sedan, weathered almost beyond recognition, but intact enough to raise the possibility that it had been preserved under sand since the day it disappeared. Investigators stood in silence as the roof, the windshield, and eventually the rear of the vehicle came into view. The paint was stripped to a dull, sunburnt gray. Glass had long since eroded. The tires were shredded, collapsed under their own weight, but the body was unmistakable. Though rusted and broken, the car matched the make and model of the vehicle tied to the 3 missing students. The recovery crew paused, and no one spoke. For 23 years, the desert had held its secret, and now, without warning, it was offering it up. The families were notified before news reached the public. Some took the call with disbelief, insisting it was too soon to jump to conclusions. Others wept, voices breaking as the sheriff explained that the car was consistent with the one they had last seen their children drive. Within a day, Media outlets caught wind of the discovery. Satellite trucks parked along the highway, reporters standing against the backdrop of blowing sand and yellow tape, announcing to the world that a breakthrough in one of the region's most enduring mysteries might finally be at hand. Recovery crews worked slowly, methodically. Each piece of sand removed was cataloged, each movement filmed. They knew what they were unearthing wasn't just a vehicle, it was a time capsule. Inside, there might be answers, or there might be nothing but dust. Either way, whatever they found would change the story that had haunted families and detectives for more than 2 decades. When the last of the sand was cleared and the sedan stood fully exposed, battered but intact, the reality was undeniable. This was not another rumor, not another false lead or cruel coincidence. The Mojave had given something back, and investigators were about to find out if the car still carried the truth of what happened on that road trip. When the last of the sand was brushed away and the battered sedan stood revealed, investigators finally confronted what families had feared for more than 2 decades. The vehicle was unmistakable. Even after 23 years buried beneath shifting dunes, the frame, the faded color, and the partially intact license plate confirmed what many already suspected. This was the car the 3 missing students had driven off in during the summer of 2002. The desert had not destroyed it. It had hidden it, preserving a silent witness to the night everything ended. Crews approached cautiously. The car was fragile, metal corroded by years of sand and heat, glass eaten away until only shards clung to the frame. Before any door was opened, photographs were taken from every angle. Deputies stood with clipboards, recording details in neat handwriting, knowing each note carried weight for a case that had gone unanswered for too long. Reporters, kept at a distance, strained for glimpses through telephoto lenses, while families waited in silence, breaths caught as if bracing for a final verdict. When the driver's side door was pried open, the interior told a story frozen in time. The seats were sun-bleached and torn, foam brittle beneath the touch. The dashboard had warped, its plastic peeling like bark. On the floorboards lay personal belongings that had not been touched since 2002. A cracked pair of sunglasses, a faded receipt from the last gas station, coins scattered as though dropped in haste. Everything inside was coated with a thin layer of sand, carried through broken seals by the desert's endless winds. And then came the discovery that turned speculation into certainty. Resting against the back seat, partially collapsed into dust, were bones, brittle, sun-damaged, stripped clean by time but unmistakably human. Forensic teams leaned in, documenting every angle, their gloves brushing fragments that crumbled at the slightest touch. In that moment, the car ceased to be an artifact. It was a grave. News of the discovery traveled fast and the reaction was immediate. For the families, the confirmation was both a relief and a devastation. After decades of wondering if their children might still be alive somewhere, there was now proof they had never left the desert. Some cried openly when told, others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what the words meant. Hope had always lived in the space left by not knowing. That space was now gone. Investigators, too, struggled with the weight of the find. For 23 years, this was the case that had defied them. Now, the car sat in front of them, not hidden in some distant canyon or smuggled across state lines, but resting just miles from where the original searches had taken place. Questions multiplied. How had it gone unseen for so long? How had hundreds of volunteers, helicopters, and search teams missed a vehicle of this size? The sandstorm had unearthed it, yes, but had the desert really been able to cover an entire car so quickly and so thoroughly that it vanished from sight for decades? The car itself seemed to mock those unanswered questions. It sat in silence, as though it had been waiting all this time, holding on to a story no one could read yet. Forensics would later begin cataloging items more carefully. A student ID was found tucked between the seats, its photo faded but still legible. In the glove compartment, a notebook with pages warped by humidity held fragments of writing, illegible but recognizable as notes from the road. In the trunk, sealed under a cracked duffel bag, was a camcorder, its casing damaged but intact, the tape inside still preserved. Each object felt like a message from the past, one that might finally speak after years of silence. But even with these discoveries, the central mystery remained. The car confirmed they had made it this far. The bones confirmed they had not survived. Yet the questions that had haunted families and detectives alike remained painfully present. Why had the car ended up here, buried beneath shifting dunes? Why had it taken a storm of extraordinary force to bring it back into view? And perhaps most pressing, what had happened in those final hours before the desert closed in around them? For investigators, the unearthing of the car was not an ending. It was a doorway. The desert had finally given back what it had hidden, but the story inside the sedan was only beginning to be told. Once the sedan was transported from the desert floor to a secure facility, the real work began. Forensic teams treated the vehicle not just as a recovery, but as a sealed archive from the summer of 2002. Every movement was cataloged, every object inside photographed before being touched. It was slow, deliberate work, the kind investigators knew might finally provide the answers that had eluded them for decades. The first priority was the human remains. What fragments were found in the backseat were carefully lifted, each bone sealed in individual evidence bags. Specialists began the process of determining how many individuals were present, comparing measurements against known profiles of the missing students. Though time and the desert had stripped away nearly everything, the fragile remains were unmistakably tied to at least one of them. Families were notified that DNA would provide final confirmation, though the process could take weeks. Attention then shifted to the objects scattered through the car. Near the driver's seat, wedged under deteriorated upholstery, investigators discovered a faded plastic card. Though cracked and warped, the name was still visible, a student ID belonging to one of the missing friends. It was the first direct link between the car and its passengers, proof that this was not just their vehicle, but the very place where their journey had ended. Other items emerged as layers of sand were cleared from the interior. A road atlas, its pages yellowed and fragile, lay across the passenger seat. Certain routes were highlighted in marker, with notes scribbled in the margins. Some of the markings seemed random, others more purposeful, but all suggested the students had been navigating by hand in the days before digital maps became standard. A half-empty water bottle rested in the cup holder, the seal still intact, its label faded beyond recognition. In the trunk, investigators pulled out duffel bags that crumbled under their gloves, clothes inside stiff with age. Each item was laid out on sterile tables, a collection of belongings that had waited silently under the sand for more than 2 decades. But among the artifacts, one object drew immediate attention. Tucked beneath the duffel bag, coated in dust, was a small handheld camcorder. Its casing was cracked, the strap frayed, but the loading compartment still clicked open. Inside was a VHS-C tape, its spool of magnetic film intact. Investigators stared at it in silence, recognizing the weight of what they were holding. After all the speculation, here was the possibility of hearing the voices of the missing again, seeing the final moments of their journey recorded in their own hands. Before rushing to play it, forensic technicians examined the rest of the car for mechanical clues. They discovered that the gas tank was bone dry, the fuel gauge frozen on empty. The engine showed no sign of catastrophic failure, no overheating or fire damage. This was not a car that had been attacked or destroyed. It had simply run out of fuel. That detail changed everything. For the first time, investigators had a plausible starting point. Stranded in the Mojave with no cell signal and no gas, the friends may have tried to find help on foot. The car had not been hidden deliberately, but swallowed by time and sand before anyone could locate it. The discovery deepened the emotional weight of the case. Families who were allowed to view photographs saw the everyday objects their children had last touched, a receipt from the gas station that had served as the final confirmed sighting, coins scattered on the floorboard, notebooks filled with half-finished ideas. Each item was a fragment of life paused in the middle of a sentence. Survivors described the experience as like opening a box packed by someone who planned to return. And still, the camcorder loomed largest. Investigators were cautious, knowing that magnetic tape could deteriorate after years in extreme temperatures. Specialists began preparations to extract the contents without destroying it, housing the tape in climate-controlled conditions, cleaning it frame by frame. The process would take time, but hope spread that, for the first time since 2002, the missing might be able to speak for themselves. The car had yielded bones, maps, and belongings, but none of those could tell the story as clearly as a voice or an image. The tape remained unplayed, its spools wound tight, holding on to moments trapped in the desert for 23 years. Everyone involved, investigators, families, even the wider community, waited in a silence that felt heavier than the sand itself, knowing that whatever the tape revealed could change everything they thought they knew. When the decision was finally made to play the recovered camcorder tape, the atmosphere inside the lab was tense. Investigators, forensic specialists, and a representative from each family sat in a quiet room, the machine humming as the cassette was loaded. For 23 years, everything about the student's disappearance had been filtered through rumor, theory, and speculation. Now, for the first time, they were about to hear the missing speak for themselves. The screen came alive with a burst of static, followed by shaky footage of an open road stretching toward the horizon. The first sounds were laughter, unmistakably young, carefree, the kind of laughter that comes from friends who believe they have all the time in the world. The camera tilted to show faces, sunburnt from long hours on the road but full of energy. They filmed each other joking, singing along to music, and pointing out desert landmarks. One of them panned the camera across the horizon as the sun dropped behind jagged cliffs, saying something about capturing the last light. For a while, the footage felt like any other college road trip, ordinary, fleeting, innocent, hours of recording condensed into minutes on playback, showing snapshots of their journey. They filmed themselves at diners, making sarcastic comments about greasy food. They held the camera out of the window, letting the wind drown out their voices as they sped down empty highways. They laughed about being lost, about how the map didn't quite match the roads they were taking. Nothing about it suggested danger. If anything, it seemed like the kind of adventure parents expect their children to return from, with stories and photographs. But halfway through the tape, the mood shifted. The laughter grew more forced. The camera showed headlights cutting across an unpaved dirt road, dust rising behind them. Voices argued faintly over the sound of the engine, one insisting the turn would cut miles off their route, another protesting that it looked unsafe. The video jolted as the car lurched, then stopped. When the image steadied again, the headlights illuminated nothing but sand. The wheels spun, kicking up dust, but the car didn't move. The voices on the recording grew louder, strained with frustration. Someone suggested trying again. Another warned they were only digging deeper. The camera caught glimpses of hands pushing against the frame, shoes sliding in loose sand. The lens tilted downward, capturing the rear tires half buried. The vehicle wasn't just stuck, it was trapped in a basin of soft desert soil, the kind that swallows weight the more pressure is applied. As the tape continued, the panic became more visible. The trio sat inside the car, debating their options. One pointed to the map, arguing that the highway couldn't be far. Another worried about leaving the car behind. The heat inside the sedan was evident from their flushed faces and the sweat glistening on their foreheads, even though the recording device did nothing to capture the oppressive weight of desert air. Time stretched. Their voices wavered between determination and fear. At one point, the camera captured the sky outside, dark now, scattered with stars. Their headlights had long since drained the battery, and only the glow of the camcorder provided light. They spoke in quieter tones then, voices subdued by the realization of what they faced. The words were not clear in every moment, but the meaning was unmistakable. They had to make a choice. Stay with the car and hope someone came along, or walk into the desert and search for help. The final minutes of the recording were the hardest to watch. The camcorder was set on the dashboard, capturing the three of them preparing to separate. Two packed small backpacks with water and maps, their movements hurried but deliberate. The third remained seated in the driver's seat, silent, staring out into the dark. The lens caught the expressions on their faces, fear mixed with resolve, the kind of look people wear when they know the risks but cannot see another way forward. As the camera ran, the door opened, and two of them stepped into the night. They turned once, silhouetted against the dim glow, their figures wavering as if unsure whether to continue. Then they walked forward, their shapes swallowed quickly by the darkness. The one who stayed behind shifted in the seat, exhaling heavily. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the tape flickered, the battery weak, the sound dropping to static. The final image was of the empty passenger seat, the desert silent outside, before the screen went black. The room where investigators watched the footage was silent too. For the families, it was the first time in 23 years they had seen their children alive. The joy of hearing their voices again was shattered by the knowledge of what came next. The tape did not solve the mystery, but it narrowed it. 2 had gone in search of help. 1 had stayed behind. The desert had swallowed all 3. And yet, even with this haunting evidence, questions remained. How far had the 2 who walked managed to travel? Had anyone ever come close to crossing their path? And what fate had awaited the one who stayed with the car as the hours turned into days? The tape had survived, but it carried no answers beyond the last frame. What it did provide, however, was a direction, a chance to retrace steps that had been erased by sand for more than 2 decades, and investigators were already preparing to follow it. The tape had given investigators what they had lacked for 23 years, a direction. It showed clearly that 2 of the students had set out on foot, leaving the 3rd behind with the car. For the first time, there was more than speculation. There was a trail, however faint, to follow. Search teams returned to the Mojave armed with this knowledge, deploying not only forensic experts, but also ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and drones. They knew the desert had shifted countless times since 2002, burying and unburying land like an ocean tide, but they also knew the students could not have gone far. The tape's timestamp and the fading battery suggested the walk began at night, without headlights, without direction, only the stars and a paper map to guide them. The search began less than a mile from where the car had been unearthed. Teams fanned out in grid formation, combing the ground inch by inch. For hours, they found nothing but cacti and rock, the same endless landscape that had frustrated them 2 decades earlier. But this time, luck, or perhaps inevitability, was on their side. Late in the afternoon, one of the cadaver dogs alerted near a small rise where the wind had scoured away a layer of sand. Investigators knelt, brushing gently at the surface, and within minutes unearthed what appeared to be fragments of bone. The area was secured immediately. Forensic teams worked under the sun, marking every discovery with flags until the slope was dotted with evidence markers. Slowly, the remains of 2 individuals were revealed, skeletal, fragile, and worn from years of exposure and burial, but still arranged in a way that told a story. The bones lay less than 50 yards apart, suggesting that in their final moments, the 2 had separated, one collapsing first, the other staggering forward before falling. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of foul play. What remained spoke of exhaustion, dehydration, and the unforgiving weight of the desert sun. For investigators, the confirmation was bittersweet. After decades of unanswered questions, the evidence was clear. 2 of the missing students had died within sight of where they had started, less than a mile from the car that had been their only shelter. The 3rd, whose fragile remains had been recovered from inside the sedan itself, had likely stayed behind as agreed, waiting for help that never arrived. Together, they had chosen a desperate plan, 2 to walk, 1 to wait, and together they had all perished within reach of one another, their fates hidden just out of sight by shifting dunes. DNA analysis provided final confirmation weeks later, though the physical evidence had already spoken loudly enough. The remains were matched to the 2 who had been seen walking off into the desert on the recovered tape. Families received the official word in solemn meetings with detectives, their grief compounded by the knowledge that their children had been so close to survival. The distance between the car and the bodies was cruel, less than a mile. If the original search had shifted just slightly, if a helicopter had flown a few degrees to the left, if dogs had caught a scent on a day with calmer winds, the students might have been found in 2002. The discoveries raised haunting questions about the initial search. How could teams have missed them? Investigators revisited reports from those early weeks, finding that the search radius had been wider than necessary. The desert had camouflaged its victims perfectly. Sand covering bodies, dunes moving overnight, footprints erased in hours. Even the bones themselves had likely been uncovered and reburied countless times across 2 decades, the land itself acting as both tomb and shroud. For the families, the news brought a devastating clarity. There was no more wondering if the missing were alive somewhere, no more fragile hope that they might return. The truth was cruel but final. Their loved ones had died almost immediately after vanishing, their story sealed beneath sand while the world kept searching. Parents wept over the photographs of flagged evidence markers in the desert, images that replaced the unknown with the unbearable. Siblings spoke of the hollow relief of certainty, that closure did not mean peace, only the end of questions. In the community, the revelation spread quickly. For years, the story of the vanished students had been passed around like folklore, speculation woven into local legend. Now, the legend had an ending. Theories of abduction, cartel violence, or staged disappearance collapsed under the weight of simple, devastating truth. They had been stranded, and the desert had taken them. People who had once whispered about sinister forces spoke more quietly now about the fragility of survival in a landscape that offered no mercy. Even among investigators, the discoveries left a mark. Detectives who had worked the case in its early days admitted to being haunted by the idea that they had walked so close without finding anything. Some expressed guilt that families had endured 23 years of torment when the answer had been less than a mile away. Others found a grim respect for the desert's power, a reminder that human effort sometimes meant little against nature's indifference. The remains of the 3 friends were eventually reunited, carried to their families for proper burial. Funerals were held, not as memorials for the missing, but as final goodbyes to the found. Photographs of the students in their early 20s sat on easels beside coffins draped in flowers, faces frozen in the brightness of youth, now contrasted with the stark reality of bones pulled from sand. For the families, there was sorrow, but also an end to the endless waiting. They could finally lay their children to rest. The truth of the desert was not the grand conspiracy many had imagined, nor the sinister plot whispered about in diners and truck stops. It was far simpler, and in some ways far crueler. 3 young people ran out of gas on a dirt road, made choices that seemed logical in the moment, and succumbed to the elements before help could reach them. Their story was not one of monsters or crimes, but of the ordinary dangers of being unprepared in a landscape where mistakes are not forgiven. And yet, even with the truth confirmed, one question lingered. If the desert could conceal a car and 3 bodies for 23 years, what else might it still be hiding beneath its endless sand? The investigation had begun with missing posters and desperate searches, and it ended with a sun-bleached sedan lifted from the desert floor. For 23 years, families had imagined countless scenarios: abduction, violence, secret lives lived elsewhere. In the end, the recovered car and the fragile tape told a story far more ordinary, yet far more devastating. There had been no crime, no conspiracy, only a slow death in an unforgiving landscape. The desert itself had been the only antagonist, silent and merciless. For the families, the resolution was a double-edged truth. On one side was relief. The mystery was no longer endless. They no longer had to picture their loved ones in captivity or drifting somewhere unknown. On the other was heartbreak beyond measure. The car had not just held bones and belongings, it had preserved the last desperate moments of youth interrupted. It had captured the laughter of 3 friends setting off into adventure, and ended with the sound of their panic as the sand swallowed their path. That tape, that vehicle, had become both memorial and evidence. Grief took different shapes for those left behind. Some parents spoke of finally being able to sleep through the night, their minds no longer consumed by wondering. Others admitted that closure was not the comfort they had hoped for, but a fresh wound, proof that hope had been misplaced for more than 2 decades. Siblings who had grown up in the long shadow of absence now faced the reality that the people who had haunted their childhoods were truly gone. They buried them not as missing, but as found, saying goodbye to people who had been frozen in time while the rest of the world aged forward. Investigators, too, felt the weight of the discovery. For years, the case had been one of the most haunting cold files in the region. Detectives who had worked it early in their careers returned for the closing press conference, standing beside newer officers who had inherited the mystery. They admitted the truth was humbling. The desert had concealed the car so well that helicopters, search dogs, and entire teams had passed within reach without seeing it. The land itself had been the keeper of the secret. It was only when a violent storm reshaped the terrain that the truth was forced back into view. The image of the car, half buried and skeletal under the sun, became iconic. News outlets replayed footage of the unearthing, satellite trucks capturing every angle. The photographs were printed across newspapers worldwide, a reminder of how fragile survival can be and how indifferent the desert remains. For locals, the discovery changed how they spoke of the case. What had once been whispered speculation of foul play was now retold as a cautionary tale about the dangers of leaving paved roads, of overestimating the safety of wide, open landscapes. Parents warned their children differently now, pointing not to imagined monsters but to the very real cruelty of heat, distance, and sand. What the car revealed was not just evidence, it revealed the fragility of trust in nature. The way ordinary choices, taking a dirt road, believing the highway was close, could spiral into disaster. It revealed the limitations of search efforts, how even the most determined hunts could miss what lay just beneath the surface. And it revealed, most of all, the enduring cruelty of time, how 3 lives could be reduced to bones and faded belongings, how families could wait decades for answers that had been sitting only a mile away. Funerals were held quietly, away from media cameras, each family choosing to remember their child as they had been before the road trip began. Some buried them in family plots, others chose cremation, scattering ashes under skies their children had once admired. There was no official monument in the desert, no plaque marking where the car had been found, but for those who had searched, the Mojave itself became the memorial. Every wind-blown dune, every stretch of empty road carried the story now. In the end, the case was closed with a final report that left little room for speculation. No abduction, no foul play, no mysterious figure waiting on the highway. The 3 students had run out of gas, made a desperate choice, and succumbed to the elements within sight of one another. The desert had hidden them, not with malice, but with its natural indifference. For 23 years, the car sat buried just beneath the sand, the only witness to their laughter, their fear, and their end. And so the story closed not with the triumph of rescue, but with the haunting reality of silence, an ordinary car, an ordinary mistake, and a desert vast enough to keep the truth hidden until it chose to let it go.